From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 100. We've made it to our centennial episode, and to celebrate, we've got an awesome guest who's super accomplished in the track and field community, but he actually has a ton to offer folks across a wide variety of sport disciplines. I've learned a ton from interacting with him and reading his work, and I think you will too, so this is a great way for us to celebrate 100 episodes. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients to support your body's nutritional needs across 5 critical areas: energy, immunity, gut health, hormonal support, and healthy aging. I'm an avid user of Athletic Greens myself, in spite of the fact that I tend to be a supplement minimalist. To me, this is a product that is much more like whole food nutritional insurance as opposed to a true supplement. The ingredients have been carefully selected at the highest quality, most natural source. You get essential vitamins and minerals, digestive enzymes, prebiotics, probiotics, and that's with the zero compromise approach from the company. It's plant-based, sourced from whole foods at the highest quality, so you won't find harmful chemicals, artificial colors or flavors, preservatives, or added sugar. Really, it's perfect for folks who are gluten and dairy-free, paleo, keto, vegan-friendly, great for people who are intermittent fasting, all that fun stuff. Personally, I love it for obviously our athletes who don't get enough nutritional benefits from fruits and vegetables because they don't eat enough. So it's a way to kind of plug in holes in diets. But also, I really like it for our college and professional athletes who may have complex travel schedules where quality food options aren't always at hand. On a personal level, I'm a husband, father of 3, and an entrepreneur. We split our time between 2 states, and I'm also still an avid lifter. So life is inherently crazy, and it can be stressful, and sleep deprivation is definitely something that we encounter. So I rely on Athletic Greens for part of my immune support, and believe firmly that it's made a big difference in keeping me healthy in spite of how crazy our lifestyle is. They've got a great offer in place. If you head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey, they'll get you 20 free travel packets with your purchase. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, and you can claim your special offer. Today's guest is a track and field coach who has coached national, world, and Olympic champion athletes. He began as a high school coach before moving to the college ranks at Wichita State University, the University of Houston, University of Texas El Paso, LSU, Texas, and Florida over a 26-year period. During his time at LSU, the program won multiple national championships, including back-to-back men's and women's national titles from 1989 to 1990. In 2006, he was hired to run the United States Olympic Training Center, and in 2009, he was made head of the Lee Valley Athletics Center by United Kingdom Athletics to organize the coaching and training of the UK's athletes in the run-up to the 2012 London Olympics. Since 2009, he's worked as both a coach and educator at Altus. Please welcome to the show, Dan Pfaff. Welcome to the show, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to chat with you, and I think this is an awesome episode in the making just because often I remind people that you have to be a good generalist before you're a good specialist. And I think a lot of your work and a lot of your teachings really have done a great job of underscoring that. And so while this may be a baseball podcast, I think we're going to speak in big picture terms so that folks can maybe appreciate a lot of the things that lead us to that level of specialization.
Yeah.
So where I'm going to start is a while back, you had a great podcast with Lee Taft, and you touched on your background as a teacher and how it shaped your career as a coach. So I'm curious, when you think about that concept, do you think the entire strength and conditioning industry at times loses sight of the importance of being a teacher, or is that a trend that maybe you haven't necessarily noticed?
Well, you hate to generalize and stereotype, but I think there's a trend or a tendency, especially with this generation of S&C coaches, to be super rich in content knowledge, but maybe a little bit poor in application or problem solving, if you will. And I think that's what being a classroom teacher or working in an educational setting kind of bridges that gap. It forces you into skills that probably aren't taught in college curriculums or certification courses.
I think that's a great point. And what are the key principles, as you look back on your teaching career that were helpful for you, and then maybe also key principles that may be imperative for a coach to have in order to continue to develop as a helper to athletes?
Well, this may be a little bit of a broad stroke, so stop me if I get lost in the weeds. But when you're a teacher, you're forced into management and communication skills that oftentimes in a homogeneous gym setting you might not be encountering on a regular basis. So you have to deal with administration and school boards and parents and different types of students. Back in my day, and that was when mainstream education was in vogue. So every type of student in the world was thrown into the same classroom. So you were forced to develop critical listening skills and learning to listen, not to talk, but to figure out where these students were. And the accountability, whether it was burdensome or not, forced you into efficiencies and foresight that you wouldn't normally get, say, in a collegiate S&C setting or professional team setting. But yet, when you talk to S&C coaches, this is where they stumble, is in management and communication.
I look at my role more than ever before. As I was kind of writing up the questions, these podcasts, I'm realizing that so much more of my role is regarding teaching and just learning how to scale things. It's one thing to feel like you have the solutions. It's another thing altogether to teach an athlete to find that solution on their own when you're not with them, or to teach a coach that may be, working, with an athlete remotely, how to actually, take advantage of that. Has that been your same experience over the course of a career?
Yeah, I think there's a gap in figuring out what people really know or what they think they understand and what they really don't know or lack layers of understanding. So a lot of people will say, yeah, I understand that, or I know that, or I've done that. But then you watch them work and they don't get it.
Absolutely. And, your work's been recognized and respected by coaches across a number of disciplines. And I guess my question for you is, I've learned a ton from you, and I'm a baseball guy, right? And I know there are people from the hockey community and, the NFL, obviously the track and field world, all those things who feel the same way. So I'm curious, what are the principles, that buy you a seat at the table, regardless of the sport in question? Like, I know, for me personally, obviously the baseball realm, it leads itself to NFL quarterbacks and tennis players and swimmers and some of these overhead athletes. Do you find that there are certain principles, and maybe it's the communication, piece that we just discussed, that kind of do buy you a seat at that table, regardless of the sport in question?
Well, I would say in review, a lot of people communicate with me because I have vast networks in all sorts of realms. And a lot of times these networks operate parallel to sport, and sometimes they're miles away from sport, yet they have influence and implication in sport. So I'd say my ability to network and build networks would be a foundational reason why sometimes I get a seat. I've always been an applied biomechanist of sorts. So I have pretty firm convictions on a technical model. Granted, there's bandwidths to all models, but if there's gross violations of the essential model, then injury risk, I think, go up and mechanical efficiencies go down. So I think a lot of people value my ability to see motion and understand motion and forces and why things might be happening or might not be happening. And with that, of course, you have to be pretty good at kinesiology and probably motor behavior, because you've got to change movement and habits and ingrained habits. And how do you do that? So most of my work today is about return to play and return to perform, or just global biomechanical efficiencies. And I think a lot of teams and organizations may have a cursory understanding of it, but they don't know how to apply it or problem solve with those skills.
Interesting. So, and actually, maybe build on that a little bit more. When we talk about like a cursory understanding, is it that they maybe appreciate the different pieces, but not how they all fit together? Like, I mean, I guess, do you have an example of what you're getting at there?
Yeah, well, I mean, ecological dynamics is the rage right now, right? So, build constraints and let the athlete explore and experience and so on. But I think it's a little more nuanced than that. Like there's not 10,000 ways to hammer a nail. Mm-hmm. Now, the loop that you use with the hammer may have some variance or bandwidth, but nobody hammers a nail in a true vertical plane or a true horizontal plane or a true diagonal plane. There's a movement loop that they replicate. So I think everybody understands ecological dynamics to some degree, but then they take it to the nth degree, and in my opinion, they lose the plot.
That's fascinating, and I think we talk about it in the context of the baseball pitch. No two are identical. It's a heavily specific motion, but the spin rate, the spin axis, the actual forces generated from the ground up to the hand are going to be markedly, or not markedly, but subtly different between each pitch. Is the takeaway from there? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of takeaways from there. Is it this concept that unyielding specificity may not be necessary to protect our athletes, that we do need to, in our training, give them an element of adjustability? Or is it just that we need to appreciate that, tissue loading is tissue loading, even when it comes in subtle variances?
Again, I think there's a lot of layers to that. So, are we exploring all stops in the force velocity curve? Are we looking at all types of strength and conditioning inputs? The type of muscle activity that we're chasing. I think it's real easy to get biased, whether intentionally or unintentionally, with our prescriptions and our paradigms and our ideology. And I kind of use the analogy. I want a big toolbox with a lot of tools, and it's my job to figure out when to use tools in a timely manner at the appropriate moment.
That's a great point, and it actually kind of leads to my next question. And we had a good exchange. I think it was back in January, and we were talking about in-season training and its relationship to injuries, and more specifically, muscle versus tendon injuries. And you commented on how, in the track and field community, some of the most significant injuries often happen, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, during the taper period. So and not only that, they're a unique type of injury. So can you maybe elaborate on those findings and then maybe even attempt an explanation on the why behind them?
Yeah, so a lot of this is tied to research Dr. Keith Barr's doing at Cal Davis on tendon remodeling and tendon research and what have you. And it was interesting that he had some observations, loose epidemiological case study collection, and it kind of mirrored what we were finding in 3 different instances. I did pretty elaborate longitudinal studies, like over 3 to 5 year periods of when are injuries happening and how severe are they? And is there a pattern or trend to these? And what we were finding is some of the most severe and the most reoccurrent injuries were happening in season, especially around championship time when people were tapering. And usually in the taper, what happens in our sport is people stop lifting, or they go to maintenance lifting, or just select a few exercises for some rationale. While in the meantime, they upregulate field work, so a lot more change in direction or sprinting or accelerating or block starts or what have you. And I think what we can infer from some of Barr's work is a lot of our classical everyday work deals with connective tissues in a unique way, where the weight room deals with those tissues, but also with the muscular system. So what we were finding is absolute strength in some of these athletes was ignored or put on the back shelf, and the tendon work obviously elevated. And so this imbalance between muscular expression and tendon or ligament expression kind of got out of kilter. And it also circles to the concept of, people have gone mad on this stiffness idea about getting joints stiffer so that they can apply force in a shorter period of time. But joint control has many variables. In my book, maybe 20 some variables that really control the movement about a joint. And there's also compliance part of the equation. So if we make something stiffer, what does that do to the compliance? Because in change in direction during amortization or yielding phases, compliance is imperative. So if we bias our training to stiffness or tendon ligament emphasis, we're ignoring a lot of the other cofactors that control joint movement, expression, and stability.
It's fascinating. Do you think there's an element of individual difference on this? This is something I've wrestled with quite a bit over the years, just in light of the population we deal with. And if you walk into a typical baseball clubhouse, you're going to find guys, who are beyond loosey-goosey. They're crazy hypermobile, and it's that remarkable congenital laxity that makes them able to contort their bodies in all kinds of crazy ways to deliver a baseball. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we certainly have athletes who are hardwired, for this stiffness concept that you outlined. It's some of what makes them, good, both their actual muscular shortness as well as probably some protective tension that's layered on top of it. Do you think the individual response here is different? That maybe, some of our more hypermobile athletes, they may better fit from like more frequent stimuli at a slightly lower intensity, almost to give them that feeling of joint stiffness that we want, or even heavier loading. And then our athletes that may carry more natural stiffness may need a little bit of a less dosage. Do you think that the level of laxity matters in this discussion?
Yeah, for sure. I think athletes in whatever sport you are coaching exist on a continuum, a spectrum, if you will. And that's the part of master coaches. They identify where this athlete sits on the spectrum, whether it's anthropology or body prototypes or, training bias. Training bias can shift us on that spectrum. So identifying where the athlete sits and then analyzing, hey, is that working for them? Things that I'm looking at is number of injuries through the season, practice time loss, games lost, output measures, various things like that. And so that should regulate our thinking or, influence our thinking on what we're doing with programming. So if you've got a hypermobile guy that is what I call more elastically biased. They use connective tissues for a lot of their power expression. Then making them stiffer might not be the way to go. But conversely, if you got a huge mesomorph that's very well developed and heavily muscled, and they're a slower converter, increasing stiffness on that person might not be the way to go either, because that may shorten their already limited range of motion down even more so. So, I think where we get into trouble is thinking in absolutism instead of, the layers of the spectrum that exist in these classifications of athletes.
Yeah. And I think we've, anecdotally, we certainly see athletes, who report feeling differently in response to loading, particularly during the in-season period, where a lot of those loose jointed athletes, they feel amazing. They actually almost want to do something daily. I've dealt with athletes that, are playing 6 or 7 days a week that want to do, 4 strength training sessions just because it feels like, they're getting something out of it that's allowing them to perform at a higher level. And then, You take other athletes at a different end of the spectrum who comment, on always feeling tight and things like that when they add more frequent lifting. So there clearly is there's an electrical charge that's taking place, to that fascial system after, a given strength training exposure. And it's certainly an individual response, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this gets into some of the topic on microdosing or minimal effective dose, and a lot of controversy in those terms. But finding out the right dosage and the right distribution of the dosage, I think, is what master coaches do well. So, I've had sprinters that if you lift once every 10 to 15 days, they're fine. And it only takes a few global lifts and they maintain their output and their health very, very well. And I've had other sprinters that, they need to lift 2 or 3 days out from a big race for a variety of reasons. And if we take that away, the output goes down. So I think it's about being open-minded and really having good measures on these outcome and output and injury data to, see if we're moving the ball forward.
Absolutely. And actually that maybe leads to another good question is, you commented on observations, right? So some of these are retrospective studies that you've done based on, anecdotal things. Then you go and you look for trends. If you're looking at a collection of athletes, after a competitive season, and you're backtracking to see, where things went wrong, right? We saw this many hamstrings and this many groins and this many calves and all this stuff. When you go back and you look at some of your preseason measures, what are your money makers, from a preliminary assessment standpoint, or what are the things that you look at in hindsight to really figure out, how to globally manage? Is it range of motion measures for you? Is it strength measures? Is it, even just, rating of perceived exertions, subjective feedback from the athletes on how they're doing at various points? Is there a collection of assessments that you hang your hat on?
Well, all of those. And we're a little bit biased here. We have an integrated performance mindset or paradigm, if you will. So, I'm looking at therapy reports, obviously biomechanical factors, outcome measures. And these outcome measures are not just sports specific. We have jump test batteries that are regular components to our weight room system, and we have various running components, and with field court sports, various change in direction measures. And like with downhill skiers, for example, what are the angles as they enter a gate? What are the angles in their joint positions when they're in mid gate, and then as they depart the gate? So seeing how those things change over time, and if there's a relationship to where on the hill they get injured, or where in the course, or where in the season. So there's a lot of layers to this. And I think the more files you have, probably the better job you've got at trying to figure out, source of problems or source of success.
Building on that, have you found it to be more challenging in certain sporting realms? Like certainly in the track and field world, there's peaking for specific competitions. You go to, the NBA and the NHL, there's multiple games per week, but it's not an everyday thing. Football is every Sunday or Saturday, depending on the level. In baseball, we have, 200 games in 230 days. Do you find that there's more noise with more frequent participation? Do you find that there's more noise, even just, having that long build before one high pressure, event? Is one inherently easier or harder than the other?
No, I think they all present unique challenges. So with baseball and NBA and NHL, there's so many competitions. We get a lot of competition information, like missed games, missed practices, out GPS measures during the game, so on and so forth. So we're getting way more pockets of data, if you will, where a track and field athlete competing once every 2 weeks, we have less density of data. So on one side, it's great, we're getting tons of data, but on the other side, we've got less room to manage or niggle or nudge because the competitions are so dense. So your ability to influence, in really dense competition sports are restricted in my mind. Where in a more open environment like track and field, competing every 7 to 10 days, you have wiggle room to influence or nudge or experiment.
I love that. And, we hinted at it just a little bit before, and I know it's a topic that you've spoken about as well. So I'm curious to see where your head is at right now. The topic of how strong is strong enough for athletes seems to have gotten much more attention, in recent years. Maybe it's because, velocity-based training has taken off, or we've gradually just shifted in the research world to looking at power a little bit more because we looked at strength and aerobic capacity in the past. It's obviously a huge topic to wrap our heads around, but do you have general thoughts on the subject? Are you feeling that this is an important discussion that we have as an industry?
Oh, for sure. And it's my bias. I do think that there's certain strength qualities and strength expressions and power outputs that are helpful, for an individual athlete. And, I kind of use the analogy of ceilings and basements. So, like, is there an upper limit that once we go beyond that limit, the cost benefit index reduces? And then there's a basement where if we don't hit a certain threshold, then are we really affecting biochemistry, bioelectrics, or, biological stimuli? So my search is trying to figure out where there's ceilings and basements for anything that I'm going to prescribe or include in the program. So, for example, with acceleration runs on a field court athlete or a track athlete, we know it takes 8 or 9 accels to stimulate certain things that we think are important. And then on the top end, we know after about 21 runs, mechanics break down or output reduces. So we have pretty defined ceilings and basements on a menu item, acceleration. And I really think that's where the future is looking at any menu item that we're going to prescribe or try to influence or bias in some way. Have we defined ceilings and basements for the dosage or the implementation of this stimuli? And then monitor and refine.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very, sport specific. What you're going to expect of a lineman or really any football player is going to be markedly different than what you might expect of an NBA player. Are there points at which you think and I hate to even use just conventional strength measures as our numbers, but are there numbers for you that, we think every one of our athletes, or at least our male athletes, maybe to narrow the scope a little bit, need to attain, to effectively start to think about sexier training? Like, what's the foundational level of strength that you see at a college level athlete that has to be attained for a lot more of these more advanced initiatives to be undertaken in a training program?
No, that's a good point. Some of this is dependent on stage of development. So, like a middle school athlete versus a high school athlete versus a college athlete or a professional athlete. So I think it's about collecting norms over time and positions over time. So, an interior defensive lineman versus a wide receiver, for example, different tasks and demands. So for me, I try to collect normative data that's position specific, sport specific, and stage or career specific. So, the strength needed by a 38-year-old quarterback versus a 22-year-old rookie probably are different.
Yeah. Would you also say what that, we've all dealt with aging athletes, right? The athletes who are, 33, 34 years old with 15 years of training experience under their belt since they got to college. And, they're trying to prolong their career and maintain a high level of function. Obviously the volume in many cases needs to come down. Where do you stand on the actual intensity side of things? Do we load them comparably, but less frequently? Do we accept that maybe less maximal strength is necessary to have, a high level of function, or just assume it's going to stick around a little bit easier because they've spent so much time building it in the past? This is one I definitely wrestle with, because we know aging athletes often feel substantially better when they lift less, but at the same time, we have to balance that against, performing at a high level, which maybe served as, by a crucial foundation of strength.
Yeah, I think all of those things are variables, but sometimes with certain menu items, we're kind of roped in with volume and intensity. So the only variable we can play with is density. So, how do you do a 70% acceleration run? That's not really challenging acceleration capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So in our mind, if you're going to do an acceleration run, you probably need to be 90% or better. So you're kind of locked in on the intensity. And we just discussed the ceiling and basement idea of volume. So sometimes with certain menu items, we're kind of locked in on the bandwidth that we can play in terms of volume and intensity. So that means the only other option we can use is this density variable, like how frequently do we do it?
That's a valid point. And obviously solicit feedback from the athlete in terms of how they're responding, and monitor performance, because if you're minimizing the frequency, you have to make sure that they're not actually detraining in the process, which is just as problematic.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us are biased by our studies and our research and the groups that we follow. So, when I was in my younger days as a coach, I just noticed with certain jumpers in season that if we did Olympics once every 10 days and did some kind of absolute strength measure about once every 16 days, that these guys maintained output and health really well. And that was heresy back then. You got to lift 3 times a week. And in season, you can drop down to twice a week. But, when I was telling people, hey, we're lifting maybe once every 2 to 3 weeks, they thought I had 5 eyeballs.
It was incredibly eye-opening for me personally. I had my first orthopedic surgery back in January. We're recording this in June. I was shocked at actually how little strength I lost, just because I'm 40 years old now, and I've basically been in a weight room for 22 years, relatively consistency. It does tend to hang around pretty well.
Well, I think this is an under-researched realm of return to play, return to perform, or aging athlete research. And I term it refractory curve. So how many sessions do we need to get back to baseline existence? So I've had athletes that retire for a year, just burn out or injuries mounted or life got in the way. And then they'll, a year later, they decide to climb back in. And I've had world-class athletes, like the third session back in the weight room after 18 months off, return to pre-existing PR levels on certain lifts. So their refractory curve is pretty steep. Now, other people on other menu items, the refractory curve may be flatter. It may take them 3 months or 6 months to get back to those existing levels. But I don't think we have very good research or data, or people are even looking at these refractory curve considerations, especially the slope of these curves.
That's a tremendous point. And maybe I'm going to challenge you in a different way. So I'm curious. You're obviously incredibly well read and a lifelong learner. What intrigues you now? What's the stuff that when you wake up at 3 a.m. and you stare off into blackness and you start to wonder, well, we don't really have an answer for this. What do you think the next frontiers are for us, in the coaching field to really learn?
Well, I think as technology improves, AI is going to give us deeper and more immediate insights into trends and patterns. I'm kind of a fractal geometry mathematician. So I wake up at night, seeing patterns within patterns within patterns. So trend analysis, pattern recognition, because again, a lot of these variables we discussed today, they have bandwidth. There aren't defined absolutes, but defining that bandwidth is critical. I mean, in our data with certain measures, if we get outside that bandwidth, we know injury risk goes up and we know output efficiencies are reduced. So I think in the world of pattern and trend analysis, that's kind of a new frontier and something I do a lot of work in. Obviously, with the work that the Stecos are doing and Schlepp in Germany and whatnot with fascia and fascia slings and and joint hydraulics. I mean, so much of our work, we look at the engineering of the human body from a statics engineering standpoint, levers and joints and whatnot, but we don't really understand the power and the function of fluid dynamics in the human body. If you've ever sprained your ankle and it swelled really bad, it adapted your movement. That's too much fluid in a space. And conversely, if you've ever been dehydrated, you know what that does to your movement outcomes. And that's an example of not enough fluid in the right places at the right moment. So I think studying and learning about fluid dynamics correlated and tied to the collagen matrix are probably new frontiers, something I'm spending a lot of time in.
And I think those intrigue me, certainly in the context of, how we produce and transfer force, but I don't want to speak for you, but they intrigue me more in the context of how we make athletes more sustainable. How do we keep them healthy? Because, we still have a world of coaches out there who maybe deny the benefit of manual therapy and maybe don't appreciate how it helps just because we haven't necessarily had the technology to really explain it. Meanwhile, it's been on cave paintings for 4,000 years. I'm curious, do you think there's a mechanism that, is more clear in your eyes that maybe just hasn't gotten out there yet? Or do you think we still have to do a lot more research to get there?
Well, again, I think we're somewhat limited by technology. So, the fascial research realm's 20 years old maybe. Yeah. And, it's coming more in vogue as people figure out how to stain fascia and how to look at fascia like in floppy cadavers versus preserved cadavers, and doing various EMG studies and ultrasound scans, where we can look at fluid dynamics in these fascial layers or in joint capsules or whatnot. So as the technology evolves, I think we're going to, find more and more answers. If I had to have a critique in sports medicine or training theory science, I think there's a lack of appreciation of joint positioning and joint function and how that affects soft tissue injuries and biomechanical outputs. I use the analogy that the joints are like pulley wheels on a block and tackle system. And if those pulley wheels are not tracking well or spinning right, then the ropes in that pulley system break. So a lot of these soft tissue injuries, well-meaning people are looking at the structures and kind of the pathology of the injury rather than looking at the causality. And my research, joint positioning and joint functioning have huge influence on this. And it's usually multiple joint systems. It's a conspiracy of joints that are causing the soft tissue injury. So our myopics of just looking at the tissue that was injured and trying to strengthen or, help improve the remodeling of the tissue is way short-sighted.
I think that's an outstanding point. In the recovery realm, obviously that's something that's vitally important, particularly as the frequency of competition goes up, but also in the context of training. What are the things that you hang your hat on? What are the most important initiatives that you found benefit to, whether you're an elite sprinter or whether you're a 15-year-old kid who's playing a doubleheader on Saturday and Sunday?
Well, this is going to sound a little cliche and probably oversimplified, but life management 101 would be first stop. If your life's in chaos and it's irregular and all over the shop, you're fighting with one arm tied behind your back. Sleep hygiene and diet nutrition would be next layers. So, those are the big rocks. If I can get athletes learning to cope and manage life and use their resources to improve life management, and I can get some consistency on the sleep hygiene front and the diet nutrition front, we're way ahead of the curve.
I love that. An important reminder to focus on the basics first and foremost.
Yeah, and then next layer stuff, like different types of saunas and, recovery mechanisms, hydrotherapies and whatnot. But, we can knock it out of the park with life management and nutrition and sleep hygiene and all these tools for recovery. But if the programming shit,
yeah,
we're fighting an uphill battle.
That's an outstanding point. It's analogous to, I guess, driving a car that's out of alignment. You can change the oil and change the tires all you want. You're still going to wind up in the same place.
Unfortunately, some people can't see the forest for the trees there.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that we always try to do at the end of these podcasts is a little bit of a lightning round where we ask a collection of questions of folks that, your answer can be as long as you want. But so first one, if you give one bit of advice to a starting out coach, the 22-year-old guy who just graduated from a exercise science program is ready to take on the world, what would it be?
Well, I'd say job well done on building a toolbox of knowledge, but now you need to go out and learn how to manage and problem solve. So build your networks, stay curious, stay diverse, and study in a broad spectrum of topics.
I love that. Now, you alluded earlier to this concept of building out a team, not just your network, but obviously the people that you work collaboratively with on a daily basis, with specific athletes that you co-manage. Are there key principles that you think are vitally important in the context of that team dynamic, the sports medicine / skill development / strength and conditioning coach scenario that we see so often in college and professional and high school sports as well?
Yeah, I think the big barrier there is learning how to build a group that operates horizontally rather than vertically. So, do all the stakeholders have an equal seat at the table? Are they listened to? Are their ideas promoted and sought and pondered? It's easy for that table to get pretty biased and pretty siloed pretty quick. And when people don't feel respected or heard or contributing, then, they're going to create chaos or they're going to shut down or work in, biased manners. So I think developing a culture of horizontal communication and respect is critical.
I love that. All right. Now, something you were wrong about and what you learned from it and how you changed.
My entire career is built on wrongs. Your humility has always been fundamentally apparent in a lot of your writings and your teaching. So I respect that a lot. What's your best example? What do you got for us? Well, growing up as I did, I was a science major and a science teacher. And so I worshiped at the altar of science pretty blindly until I was about 30. Well, I actually started in grad school where I learned that stats can be distorted to say whatever picture you want. But I would say I went down the rabbit hole of following science blindly without a critical thinking hat on.
I think that's a great point and a good one to end on. Dan, this was outstanding. No surprise there. You've been a great contributor to the field for a long time, and I know I've benefited a lot. Folks can find you on Twitter. It's at PFAFFSC, and they can also check you out via altis.world. It's ALTIS.world, where you have some great educational products there and collaborative efforts with some other excellent coaches. Thanks so much for taking the time. This was a blast, and I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well.
Well, thanks for having me. A lot of respect for what you guys do and how you do it.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.